Let's dive right into H.E. Bates' The Ox. Today, we're going to meticulously unpack what is honestly one of the most quietly devastating short stories you're ever likely to encounter on your syllabus. Picture this: a woman dragging a rusty old bicycle down a muddy lane. She isn't even riding it, she's just dragging it, totally overloaded with way more than she can actually carry, and yet somehow she's carrying it anyway. She never complains, she never cries. Not even when her husband is arrested for murder, and not even when her entire life savings just vanish overnight. It naturally leads us to one profound question. Is Mrs. Thurlow the strongest woman in English literature, or is she the saddest? So, here's our game plan for today. We'll start with the author and naturalism, walk through the plot of The Ox, dive into the core themes and analysis, break down the essential literary techniques, and finally, look at exactly how to ace your exam questions. All right, kicking things off with part 1, the author and naturalism and the roots of H.E. Bates. To really get this story, we've got to look at where Bates actually came from. Born in 1905, he was the son of a shoemaker. He didn't have this formal, aristocratic literary background. Instead, he learned straight from the working people of the English countryside. He started out as a reporter, just watching and recording things without ever preaching to the reader. Over his career, he wrote incredibly successful wartime stories under the pseudonym Flying Officer X, and he even created the really warm, colorful television hit The Darling Buds of May. So the crucial point here is that Bates proved over his entire career that he could absolutely write incredible warmth and comedy. And that makes his choice to be so cold and clinical in The Ox a highly, highly deliberate one. And this brings us right to his alignment with naturalism for this specific story. See, while a romantic writer looks at the countryside and sees this beautiful, peaceful, spiritually renewing escape, a naturalist like Bates looks at that exact same landscape and asks, okay, but who is breaking their back to maintain it? Bates treats his characters not as free agents making noble, heroic choices, but as products shaped entirely by their harsh, unforgiving environment. Moving right along to part 2, the plot of The Ox, which is truly a tragedy of labor. At the absolute center of this story is Mrs. Thurlow, a woman who for 15 brutal years lives in existence defined entirely by physical work. She doesn't have hobbies, she doesn't have this rich inner monologue. She spends 15 long years scrubbing floors with an unshakable discipline purely to save money for her 2 sons. And she somehow manages to compress all 15 of those back-breaking years into exactly 54 pounds. That single number represents her entire life's effort. But then tragedy hits. Her damaged husband, a veteran of the First World War, commits murder. He gets caught and is hanged. But right before all of that permanently unfolds, he steals every single penny of those hard-earned savings. Now, notice what Bates doesn't give us as this tragedy unfolds. After the crime, after the massive theft, there is no emotional breakdown. She simply absorbs the blow and stoically protects her sons by sending them away just to avoid the social shame of being a murderer's kids. Then comes the ultimate betrayal. When they're exposed to a wealthier uncle's refined world, her sons actually begin to view their labor-worn mother as an embarrassment. They cruelly reject her. And after all that, she just stoically endures, returning to her quiet, ox-like labor right up until her life quietly ends. Let's shift gears to section 3, core themes and analysis. It's time to deconstruct the devastation. So the single most important conceptual point to wrap your head around here is the massive difference between resilience and endurance. Resilience means bouncing back, right? Adapting and rebuilding a new sense of self after a trauma. Mrs. Thurlow's endurance, however, just means absorbing damage without changing at all. When her husband is hanged, she keeps working. When her money is stolen, she keeps working. Her endurance isn't heroic. It's honestly just a slow erosion until she's worn entirely away. Which leads us straight into the theme of dehumanization. Because of this extreme poverty, society literally stops seeing Mrs. Thurlow as a human being with an inner life. Instead, they only value her as a unit of labor. She isn't valued as a wife, she isn't really valued as a mother, but purely for what she can pull, haul, and produce. They're effectively reducing her to the level of livestock or machinery. And because her endurance is so perfectly silent, the completely indifferent society around her just assumes she doesn't need anything. This is the invisibility of quiet suffering. Bates is fiercely critiquing an economic system that only has room for people as long as they're useful, totally discarding her the second she can no longer work. Then there's the tragic reality of her motherhood. She basically uses labor as her one and only language of love. She turned motherhood into an economic project to save her sons. And the painful irony is that in becoming this highly efficient mechanical mother, she loses the human warmth required for her sons to actually love her back. She succeeded in shielding them from poverty, sure, but it was a completely failed economic investment because she alienated the very people she sacrificed everything for. Bates is making a profound argument here. He's saying poverty isn't just a lack of cash, it's an ontological condition, meaning it is a fundamentally identity-destroying force. Poverty fundamentally changes what a person is in the eyes of the world and eventually in their own eyes, totally reshaping her posture, her silence, and her very sense of self. Even the sweeping English landscape acts like a psychological prison for her. Instead of providing romantic comfort or peace, the setting just mirrors the sheer indifference of the world. The open land simply demands more toil from her bent figure, heavily emphasizing her entrapment rather than offering any sort of escape. All right, on to Section 4, Essential Literary Techniques, or the Architecture of Empathy. The title of this story, it is definitely not just decorative. Bates systematically strips away her humanity, using these highly physical, animalistic symbols. He describes her bones as lumpy, and her pinned-up skirt as a thick, stiff tail, literally depicting her as an ox. And this beast of burden symbolism's paired so ironically with a rusty bicycle she has to drag like a yoke. A bicycle should symbolize speed, right? Freedom. But for her, it perfectly illustrates a woman who is always in motion but literally never getting anywhere. Now, Bates executes this entire story through a totally unsentimental narrative voice. He plays the clinical observer, just reporting the facts flatly. He never once writes, "Oh, how tragic her fate was," because that would supply the emotion for you. By refusing to give the reader the comfort of cheap melodrama, he forces you to do the emotional heavy lifting yourself, and that makes the pity you feel far, far more powerful. And by combining that objective voice with a severe lack of interiority, meaning we almost never get access to her private thoughts, Bates keeps us at a deliberate distance. On top of that, he uses clipped mechanical syntax filled with grinding work verbs, like scrub, haul, and pull. He ensures that the prose itself actually performs the isolating, repetitive, and mechanical theme of her labor. Finally, Section 5, Acing Your Exam Questions. Let's turn all this analysis into marks. When it's time to actually write your essays, you want to map the themes we just talked about directly to the classic exam prompts. So, if you're asked about the title, discuss the literal metaphor of her temperament alongside the social critique of a system that treats her like an animal. For narrative technique, hammer home that unsentimental, clinical observer style. For the bicycle, focus on the painful irony of a freedom tool becoming a heavy yoke. And for maternal sacrifice, explain the tragic irony of her failed mechanical investment in love. Whatever the specific question ends up asking, make sure you use these essential takeaways. Always frame Mrs. Thurlow as a victim of an indifferent society, not just bad luck. Argue the tension between her survival and whether her stoic endurance actually just traps her further. And always, always anchor your conclusion on the story's central tension, the tragic reality of a woman destroyed not by one big dramatic event, but by the slow, silent accumulation of invisible burdens. It's a world where her endurance is fatally mistaken for strength. H.E. Bates leaves us with no heroes to cheer for and no villains to blame. He just gives us a woman who worked until she had absolutely nothing left to lose because she had already given all of herself away. It forces us to ask this final honking question about the true nature of survival. Is resilience sometimes just another word for the endurance of the intolerable? Think about that as you digest all of this. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and happy studying.